Greetings, fellow Empyreans. I am Ashterothi, and this is the Eve Universe Show, Thursday, November 18th. And we are here to discuss a couple of things today that we want to go over. I have two big topics for us to look at today, and hopefully it'll garner us some good discussion. We have the, they're pretty related to, and about this ongoing discussion. We have CCP Rattati, who is the Eve economic, or Eve ecosystem kind of czar, as I jokingly called him yesterday. He did an interview with MMORPG where he gives a lot of interesting insight and kind of responds to a lot of the player feedback, or rather the player reaction, in a way that I think is really good, especially considering how his previous reactions have been taken, or how they were taken, and how they've been portrayed. So we're going to look at that. We're going to see what he has to say and see what we have to say about that and how it relates to the changes that are happening or not happening. And then we also have the monthly economic report for October, which came out. And so we're going to look at that and look at some of the last few months and see if we can suss anything out. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into this with the MMO article. Posted it in chat, and here we go. So, needs to be a little bit further over here and on top. All right. So this is called, as EVE Online players protest, CCP responds to feedback regarding proposed New Dawn mining changes. So already kind of an interesting title. But we'll see what their response to our feedback is. Over the weekend, EVE largest trade hub, also known as G244, erupted into a flurry of activity. Players congregated around the monument behind the Navy Assembly Yard, orbiting the fourth planet of the Gita system, shooting the monument with everything from their standard ship weapons to fireworks. Local chat was abuzz with more than normal as player counts in the area skyrocketed. So, by the way, I want to talk about this a little bit. You know, obviously I came out with a very strong position about the Gita riots and the Gita protests and all that stuff. And I do want to admit that in the back of my head, I have somewhat softened on that position, because while it is true that, you know, the Gita protests happened the way they did because it was meaningful to what was happening at that moment. And while it is also true that this successful protest is often co-opted by smaller and often more petty demands or desires, for it uses demonstration for that, there is something to be argued about Gita being the public square, and thus the place that you would go to show off how many people, to put it in front of everybody's face, how many people are upset about this. Like, it was challenged to me, like, what should they have done instead? And while you could try to get creative about that, you know, just if you just think about it this way, if they had just protested in 1DQ, or even, here's a better one, if they had even protested in Amar or, you know, somewhere else, I don't know if it would have the same effect. So while I think that we could probably figure out a more creative way than always shooting the monument, I definitely see the value in having the way that we display our protests such that they can be measured against each other. And I think that that has some value. And I think that it would be completely unfair to say that the protest that happened over the weekend had no effect. I think that the protest that happened this weekend didn't get a point across beyond the energy behind the overall stuff, but the outcry does put energy behind the more nuanced responses, such as Dunk Dinkle's blog and others. So there is case to be made. It still doesn't quite sit right with me, but there's a case to be made. Anyway, a protest has started with players expressing a displeasure at recently released dev blog by CCP Games. Yes, the last 2 years have been rough for many EVE players, a time for scarcity brought on by developers in an attempt to balance the economy and state of the MMO from what it was perceived to be an unhealthy state to one that is sustainable into the next decade. In that time, pilots at New Eden had seen the resource stockpile diminish, ISK levels drop, and war rage ravage the universe. I guess to put it a different way, even at its worst, I would have to argue that if it's stupid but it works, then it's not stupid. So, like, even if I call the technique stupid, it's the response, it works, is absolutely a fair response, you know? They should move the Jita monument further away to the station so that it can't be smart bombed. I mean, the fact that it is on the opposite side of Jita, so that, or Jita 4.4, so that way it doesn't disrupt the undocking, is also probably good. The light at the end of the tunnel is a return to the a level of prosperity to which many players, to many players meant a return to what we saw before the blackout, before the invasions, and before the scarcity era. Unfortunately, the expectations didn't exactly match up with the vision that CCP had lined out, something that the developers also admit when talking to MMORPG in an interview about the reaction to the blog post. And I think that this really does actually capture the problem really, really well. Because this is there really is two problems that are compounding each other. There is probably some deep or problematic pieces to the implementation or to the design of what they're trying to do. Actual things that need to be criticized and whatnot. But man, was expectation management poor, right? Like they. And I saw it, and I said it many times, where it's like, okay, we were on the right. They brought us to the left. Now they're bringing us to the center. We're not going to go all the way to the end. It just, the problem is that in absence of CCP clearly reinforcing what's going on every step of the way, it opens up the opportunity for any old dude to step in and speak for them with nothing to contradict them, right? This is how we get citadels are guaranteed to be protected. This is how we get orcas are designed for solo mining. This is how we get the end of scarcity means the return to pre-scarcity, right? And while these concepts were communicated, they certainly weren't forcefully communicated, if that makes sense. Or at least they didn't communicate it so clearly that the people that claimed that, like, they just needed to claim it clearly and consistently enough such that anybody who is having this conversation and try to make that argument would just be pointed to that. All right. The other problem is that the pointing out, like, the teasing. So for months, they used actually since July, they've been using the end of the year to be the end of scarcity. CCP is the one that sold that as the solution to everyone's problems, without a clear definition to what the end of scarcity meant in July. They gave us 6 months to answer that question for ourselves. And what that meant increasingly was every single problem I've had will be fixed, right? The struggles that I'm going through now will be over. I will get to the end, and then it will be better. And they even threw out some breadcrumbs or some meat for the hounds, as it were, with things like, oh yeah, there's going to be moon and ice compression, right? Or sorry, moon and gas compression. Only saying the good things without the medicine. At first, it would seem like that might be the right thing to do, but what that means is that it's too easy to come off as a bait and switch, if that makes sense. Which we'll look at more when it comes to his actual reaction to the the reaction to the reaction. I'm reacting to CCP Rattati's reaction to the player base's reaction. Wow. All right. Well, you know, this is what we do on the internet now. It's about communication. They don't have live. They do not have live shows with the devs to discuss or any changes that are implemented. Yeah, and I actually discussed this with CCP yesterday at the AT interview, which you'll be able to see on YouTube in a few minutes, or you know, right after this show if you're watching it live, or it should be on YouTube if you're watching it on YouTube. But I talked to them about that, about how did the pandemic and therefore the absence of events in which CCP now has to be on stage for several hours over the course of multiple days and answer questions and discuss things. Did that have an influence on them, or did that have an impact on them? And they even admitted that they didn't realize how big of an impact that was having until it was too late. And now it's been basically, okay, well, how do we get back to what we had, right? Like, had they have had a fan fest last year, and had they have had an Eve Vegas last year, we would have had a lot more time to prep, and a lot. And as I pointed out, I don't believe that there's no dev blog that would have properly communicated it. It would have required something like that, where it's ongoing conversations, you know, where you can watch the dev explain it to you, give your feedback, and get the dev's responses to it live. Omega Gold, Omega Gold reacts to me by saying, Ashterothi reacting to CCP Rattati's reaction to the player base's reaction to CCP's reaction to the player base's reaction to scarcity, which was CCP's reaction to the abundance economy. Woo! Which was in turn CCP's reaction to, never mind. It's turtles all the way down at this point. All right. We're never going to get through this if I keep doing this. All right. Let's get to what actually he said. It's been a long road. Eve directors of product, CCP Rattati. I'm not even going to try. Nope. Nope. Said in a response to we'll see. Said in a response to whether or not the dev team expected this kind of reaction. I think that the expectation for many was that we're going to go back to what it used to be, like literally used to be. And I think that this, and we'll see more as he talks, I think that one of the things is that like CCP expected and planned for a negative reaction. Like, of course this is not going to be popular, but I think this idea of it being mapped against pre-scarcity was something that, and that being so locked in was something that they weren't prepared for, which, you know, I mean, so if you, as with the other thing with like the realizing too late about presentations and stuff, like on the one hand, sure, but on the other hand, these are human beings. Human beings make mistakes. We're all doing this live. Nobody did what they were everything they were supposed to do perfectly for their job last year. Like, we learn. That's how, you know, good decisions come from experience, which comes from bad decisions. All right. CCP Rattati continues stating that the team could feel that there's some pushback. The team could feel there would be some pushback as they're already getting premonitions from the Council of Stellar Management. Nice. So now that it's the Council of Stellar Management, especially given like Final Fantasy and the Astrologian or whatever, now I get it. Like, so the Council of Stellar Management we thought that it was called that because like we live in space, but it's really, they see it as like reading the omens, right? They're reading the signs in the stars. They're getting premonitions. All right, which is a elected player council. Yes, we know what it is. Brand manager, another name, echoed this, stating that there are varying beliefs as well as to the end of scarcity would actually mean. Everybody in the community has a different opinion of what the end of scarcity meant and how it, and now that it's the end, and for some people that's a total anticlimax, as they had just a different expectation as far as that it had meant. Now I want to make a meme of like the your first time, and it's the gallows, and it just shows like a rope wall, you know, photoshopped over the guy who's being hung, and the guy who's saying your first time is just has an Edencom logo. Like, anticlimactic conclusions is bread and butter. Anywho, much of the discussion in the community is a response to last week's devlog titled From Extraction to Production, centers on changes to the most used and powerful mining ship in the MMO, the Roke Wall. I think that if this fact is true, this is a good indication of the problem. The fact that the most powerful mining ship in the game is also the most used seems just on the surface of with an MMO that has a population graph the way that it does, like a population age graph within the game as it does. It just doesn't feel to me like what if I said that the Titan is the most used combat ship in EVE? Would that make you feel like the game is balanced? No. So yeah, I feel like the best one should not necessarily always be the most used one. Anywho. Well, I guess Omeka points out, I don't think that they were expecting to return to old abundance economy. I think that it wasn't helped along, or I guess it was hurt by the fact that a lot of people were calling for CCP to just roll it back to pre-scarcity era as if that was an option. And so, again, since CCP didn't present a firm, clear image of what scarcity ending would in fact be, people filled in the gap. And those people that filled in the gap had no interest necessarily in being accurate, but more about projecting their own desires. And then when the results didn't meet those desires, then it felt like it didn't meet their expectation. You see what I'm saying? All right. One of the greatest resources, if not the greatest resource we all have, is our time. Time spent reading a book, learning a new trade, or having fun with friends in our favorite game world is all valuable resources that we spend, in addition to any money we throw at something. Time is money, friend. Players, especially those who have spent time and money getting into the Roke Wall, specifically are showing displeasure as it is being transitioned from a mining ship into a purely support platform. So, okay, look. On the one hand, this is exactly what I was talking about when I said the HTFU thing yesterday, where it's like, yeah, this happens before, right? Like, and people spend time and money and invest in a certain niche or thing in EVE and then have that changed up entirely. This is a very, I'm not going to say common, but historically precedented thing in EVE Online. The only constant is change, as it were. So, but one thing that does show is that CCP Rattati is clearly aware, at least, that this is where the players are coming from on this. People get the only SP that's being refunded is the refining skills. And that's simply because since they're collapsing down, I think it would be too difficult for them to create like an algorithm to translate them from the old to the new. So it's just like, okay, we're reimbursing all of the old and giving you the opportunity to respec it into the new. Historically, the only time that they've fully reimbursed skill points is like when a skill is rendered completely useless. Things like, well, the most famous is, of course, learning skills. And the only other example that actually springs to mind was fact skills, which were introduced into the game and then were quickly decided to not be in the game. And so when the actual changes happened, that skill was actually reimbursed. All right. Something that might not justify its value to a pilot for the risk involved within docking with one. Dunk Dinkle, the CEO of Brave Collective, summed it up quite well in his blog post on the update. Saddling these billion-plus ISK ships with the mind-numbing task of sitting on field to compress materials painfully while a command burst cycles endlessly is just no fun at all. It fielded a huge target for hunters with no realistic way for the ship to earn its way to profitability. and I said this a lot before. I'm going to keep reading this. Players who own orcas and rorquals are owners of ships that don't justify their build costs. Only the safest and wealthiest areas in New Eden will see these fielded, further pushing the player meta to join only the biggest and most powerful groups, reducing diversity in corps and alliances. So if a player owns a rorqual with excavators, suck it up, Buttercup, you are SOL. Might not feel like the new age of prosperity. Like, okay, first of all, his final point is right, and of course, I did a full, response to his dev blog or his blog. Which, by the way, I also want to point out that he knows way more about like large scale mining than I do. So like, there's a big piece of it where if we sat down and differed on the thing, I would just defer to him when it comes to these mining things and such. And he actually did encourage me to go out and try it for myself. I don't think that would actually help me that much. Like if I go out and just experiment with the rorqual, not having done that much with it already, it's more helpful to me for people who have experienced it and are experiencing this change to communicate with me. And then, I can push back with my thoughts on it. And then as they explain to me more, that's where we get the truth out of the situation, right? More than just me just going on Sissy and doing it. Although I probably will. Either way, this final point is true. However, this first point is only mostly true because of the fact that you have to like load it manually, more or less, like the cargo bay restriction. Because ultimately, if it was automated, more or less automated, then I still refuse the argument that this is any different than it is now, right? You can't tell me that rorqual mining right now is super exciting and that's being taken away. Like, I don't know. And the idea that orcas aren't going to be used in, I guess safest would be high sec, right? I don't know what they mean by safe. I don't know what he necessarily means by safest, but I think that the orc is going to be used a lot still. But at the same time, if it's too dangerous for an orca, that just means it's got a niche. We now have a good niche for the porpoise, right? So, yeah. And this is the mindset that, wait, that's a different name. Hold on. Which name is that? It was echoed by somebody else. That was the other person, right? Yeah, that was the brand manager. That's not, so this is not CCP Rattati. So CCP, I don't mean to like drive it home, but like, he's not the one that's saying it's perfectly understandable. But either way, I think this is, so is this, I'm assuming that this is just more, man, I don't know who made this quote now. We're for setting up the Eve for the 3rd decade and then hopefully it outliving us. This is a really big point. And this is the problem with a lot of the communication and feedback over the last 2 years, is that it's all about forest for trees, right? What CCP is doing is there's 2 different things happening with all of the changes. One is the impact of the change itself on what is happening right now, right? Market speculation, the starting and stopping of wars, the actual reaction by the player base and its change in player behavior, or its impact on player behavior. But then the second piece of this is, of course, the final design. The idea is that their old design had some serious flaws to it. And so while they don't necessarily know the perfect new design, they can't just start over. So they have to do this all live, with the idea that like it almost, by that notion, it almost doesn't matter how painful it is, because they gotta get there. This is the burden that they've saddled themselves with by trying to get a 20-year-old game ready to be able to go through the next 10 years. And I'm not saying that to like white knight them. What I'm saying that because that's an extremely critical pressure to put on the development team. And so they could very well want you to be happy with the changes and have the immediate response be a certain way, but ultimately, if they think that the final result, what they're working towards, is going to be successful, then there's a certain amount of like it makes it insulates themselves from feedback in a weird way. And it does honestly somewhat harken back to the old like Ice Tower methodology of CCP, where they thought that they knew better. It's definitely not that. They're still responding to feedback. But the issue is that their response to feedback is coming from a completely different context and understanding of the design of the game than the player base. And while this has always been true, given the fact that they are trying to change things that they think have maybe always been wrong or have been gone off whack at some other point, or things that maybe had always wanted to be this way, but there was compromises in the earlier ways. Because a lot of these changes end up going back to the original design of these concepts and kind of like reimagining what they would be with modern design. So, yeah, it's really challenging, and I think that this is why, like, continually like having feedback channels, communication, and maintaining as much civility as possible is so critical, because it's like, in the end, CCP Rattati is the guy who's making this happen. So the best that we can understand where he's coming from and therefore communicate with him and therefore get him on our side on things that are critical, the better off we're all going to be. At the same time, the other problem is that there's been plenty of times where the player base has cried out that things are absolutely dumb and they were absolutely wrong. And the player base is really good at lauding how right they are and ignoring all of the times that they're wrong, especially since the player base is not a monolith and it's very easy to find somebody who said the right thing, right? So all of this complicates the whole feedback process. Anyway, and this journey meant tighter belts for players that were used to a lot more luxury. It has also meant a complete institutional shakeup on how to make ISK and how to develop things in EVE. And it being an 18-year-old game, I'm sure a lot of players have the feeling of rug being pulled out from under them now that they have become accustomed to or used to. So their feelings are totally understandable. I feel like this might be Rattati, but it could just be continued to be this guy. But I do want to say, like, this reminds me of the quote that I see keep kicking around. I haven't been able to find the original source of it, but CCP Rattati saying that as supply dwindles, then prices will go down, which on this, or whatever it was, on the surface, it looks like it's flagrantly wrong. And it's enough that it's kept me up at night thinking, like, what could he possibly have meant by this? And so I have a theory. I think what he means by that is that as supply dwindles, the price goes up. When the price goes up, that makes people feel like now's the time to release things, their stockpiles, which drives the price back down. So I'm not saying he's right, but that's the closest thing to a cohesive sentence I can come up with that accurately describes at least what he's trying to say, to my understanding. IMO CCP needs to stick to their guns on this one. They added these knobs and valves in place for a reason. We'll see about that, because he talks about some of the things about this. I think that they should stick to their guns about some of it, but I think that staying true to why they're making these design decisions is important, but understanding that how things feel to the player can be just as important as the mechanical balance of things. Therefore, if it feels bad, it almost doesn't matter that it's mechanically good. It won't feel rewarding, and that's still broken. we're getting there, Fonsui. In the end, though, the rogue wall likely needed to be nerfed. Many players agree with Reddit, with this Reddit as well as on the official forums. According to CCP Rattati, the capital ship was doing more harm to Eve than many players realize in its current state. What's funny about that is that every single time I've ever said that the rogue wall was too strong, I keep pointing out that they keep nerfing the mining, and the real problem was its defensive capabilities. So, like, they should keep its mining capabilities, but lose a lot of its defensive capabilities. Like, and I've brainstormed all kinds of ways of doing it, and it really feels like they did the exact opposite. Anyway, a lot of players, play styles have had their time in the sun. Like, for sure, carriers, super carriers, titans. We've gone from doomsdays killing everyone in the system to anything in between. And this is accepted in an MMO that your playstyle is not going to get changed. Is going to get changed even if it is overpowered. I would say that in regards to the rogue walls. I wrote something on Reddit that the rogue wall suppression were basically against everyone because it changed the whole economy. Them turbo mining with basically pricing almost every other miner out of the game, etc. But it's hidden in a way. So this is a really good point. Let's go ahead and keep going into this, because this is actually really important and flies in the face of a lot of the arguments that players like to make. It's funny that you know, like the removing excavators from the rogue walls. Ironically, that is canonically one of the easiest solutions for them to implement, because canonically the excavator drones are like barely contained rogue drones, and with all of this new rogue drone stuff happening, the idea that CCP could just say, oh, and now excavators have broken free, all of the excavators are now actually rogue drones, good luck. Then, I mean, that would be removing excavators from the game, right? All right. Not saying they should, just saying that they literally left themselves that out if they wanted it. Like, cool. I'm just getting cheaper battleships, but there are a lot of victims. It's weird that he uses battleships for his example. Should have gone with destroyers. But there's a lot of victims. There's a lot of people out there who are out of a job and not getting paid properly for their time. This is an interesting, weird point, because like a lot of this keeps coming back to like creating new professions, and yet the problem is that a lot of people are out of a job. It's like, how do I progress in my mining career when I can't afford a rogue wall because the rogue wall is undermining everything I do? Oh, I see. Oh, I'm sorry. They're talking about the impact under rogue walls, not under the change. So they're saying, like, with rogue walls mining everything, battleships are cheap, but a lot of other people are muscled out, and therefore there are less jobs. That's what he's arguing. It's like a factory moving into a small town and just killing all the jobs. That's oppressive, and you don't see it. It's kind of hidden behind the scenes. A Titan blasting everyone out of space in a single system, that's so clear. So I think that what we're seeing here is a hidden power. So what he's arguing is kind of almost like a more on-the-nose version of what I talked about earlier this week, which is that the problem with the invocation of new bros as part of this change is the fact, and really all of scarcity, right? The idea that like, oh, well, this hurts the new bros. But the problem is that new bros are the least likely to be mining at that high level. And therefore, you know, you in your rogue wall are outperforming 10 new bros in anything that they have at their disposal. I'm not even talking about alphas. I'm talking about like mining barges, even you know, whatever. Technically Tech 2, but like Tech 2 is really dangerous. So a lot of people stick with just mining barges. Like, it is not rewarding. Like the rocks that you mine with mining barges aren't worth that much, partially because there's so many of that rock and the minerals that come from that rock already out there. And that's mostly because there are these rogue walls that are harvesting things at 10 times or more than you possibly can. And you are in competition with them, right? It's supply and demand. So when, you know, it is often framed that roll calls are good for new bros because they are a thing to aspire to, but it also makes the current thing oppressive. That's like saying that like hazing in school against freshmen is good because it incentivizes them to look forward to when they're a senior, right? Like that's what. Why not just make it so that you can't allow the top end to be so oppressive it renders all of the other tiers below it obsolete. This is the same as like that I sometimes complain about when it comes to supers sometimes, right? Like if supers are so capable that they can apply down the chain on subcaps, then suddenly it becomes a question of like, why would you ever field, especially if supers are also relatively cheap, why would you ever field things that are smaller? Why would you field battleships over carriers? Why would you field cruisers over carriers if carriers can kill cruisers? And so in the same sort of way, if you had the opportunity to mine with a Rorqual or any other ship, why would you mine with any other ship under any other condition when you have the capability to? And the answer being simply you wouldn't, unless it's high sec, in which case, use an Orca or whatever. Like that just ends up being not a great answer, especially for the people that, like, you're basically saying, don't worry, man, in a year, you'll be great. And honestly, this is a bigger cause of people feeling that CCP is pressuring people into using skill injectors, right? Like, because they have to inject to these capital ships to be competitive miners. Like, what if a mining barge was a competitive miner? Anyway. So what he's suggesting is that battleships being super cheap as a consequence of the glut of minerals is great, unless you're one of those people that get the minerals at a scale smaller than Rorquals. It's like how T1 industry isn't profitable because the people with capabilities and efficiencies are able to just take care of the whole problem themselves, right? So it doesn't provide niches in the same sort of way as something that requires a little bit more focus or expertise. All right. Oh, this is, CCP Rattati goes on to talk about what they're doing to ensure the Rorqual is still an aspirational goal, and that the ship itself still serves a purpose. However, it being the best miner was never the goal at all. Hold on. Have you forgot the thing that fielding a Rorqual versus a barge also has the risk involved with it? I had 2 Rorquals die before they even paid half of what they cost. Normally, I agree with you on that. That being said, I also have definitely seen the argument that you would use a Rorqual over mining barges or other situations because Rorquals can survive a lot more than the barges will. The barges will just get whacked. It's a touch and go. I mean, Rorquals are also very defensive, especially compared to anything lower. We have to find the purpose. Wait, hold on. Yeah. The goal, though, isn't to turn the Rorqual into just a fleet boosting platform, something that the players are already pushing back against after reading the changes. And some people were actually pushing for this change beforehand. I've had many conversations where people have been like, oh, we'll just remove all mining from the Rorqual. And I'm like, I don't know if that's good either. But yeah, the team is looking to make the Rorqual something more in line with the fantasy they had in mind with the capital ship that works in the fleet to maximize its potential. And I feel like they're stealing my terminology at this point, right? Because I always talk about the core fantasy of different jobs or roles or things within these games. But yeah, the core fantasy of the Rorqual, as I discussed in my video from like 2016, was not a miner, but a foreman. What does it mean to be a foreman? A leader of miners. It's a command position. I don't know. We have to find the purpose of the Rorquals as an aspirational goal. We can't just say all of this is worthless. And we have been working a lot on it. we've wanted to give them this special compression power, then only they... Oh, sorry. Hold on. We wanted to give them this special compression power, then only they would have, which was very coveted. It's been talked about for a long time to give it actually more strength than that. So compression of gas and ice and moons at sight would be pretty awesome. We've also hinted at the fleet boosting or fleet jumping capabilities, which is kind of cool. Aha! See? See? It's not just a module on Sissy that they're throwing on for experiments, or we don't know if they're going to do anything. It was hinted at. And they know what goes on Tranquil on Sissy at this point. They know when they put that on there, we're going to talk about it. And it's a good way for them to get us to start talking about it without actually suggesting that they're going to do it. What if we move back to specialization like the old mining barges? For example, the Rorqual is really good at mining high-quality moon ore, but sucks at all other mining. I mean, yeah, could be a very good option. Do you think it is partially that people don't play EVE how CCP want them to play it? When I started, sure, it was Exhumers and Hulks with Rorqual boostings, but over time, it has become more multi-boxing. Absolutely. Hold on. Do I think that CCP thinks that EVE, people are playing EVE wrong and are trying to change their behavior? Absolutely. Do I think that they think that multi-boxing is part of the problem? Absolutely. Given the opportunity, a player will optimize the fun out of their own game. And there's a huge thing in game design about adjusting the design as such that you make it so that the players are rewarded for making the more fun decision. Because if you give them a boring but optimal solution, they will do it and then accuse you of forcing them to do it. That quote comes from one of the guys who made Civilization. A good example of this that's often used is XCOM, where the nature of the permadeath of XCOM made it so that players were playing incredibly passively and defensively and causing the enemies to come to them. So for XCOM 2, they introduced a mechanic that forced players to push in, either because of like time battles or because of things happening deep in that they had to go deal with, so to incentivize a more aggressive play style, which resulted in more fun. Players don't... You are not instinctively encouraged to do things the most fun way often, because fun comes from facing the challenge. All right. Has anybody noticed the DPS buff to the Roques? Yep. They've become more defensive. Have Rorquals interact with iHubs in some way? It could be true, although one of the things I do find very interesting about this is, like, with the changes of Moongu, there is, like, I've considered the idea of bringing over a Roque to have in Losec simply to do compression. Is this devblog or PR spin? We're going to go with PR spin. This is an interview between CCP Rattati and MMORPG.com. Why would anyone need Moongu compression on a Rorqual when there's an Athanor 150 kilometers away? So I'll give you a hint. So the reason why the Moongu compression is the way it is because R4 Moongu is now really important to a lot of things, and R4 is mined mostly in HiSec and cannot be reacted in HiSec. The place that you do the reaction is sometimes different than the place that you do the mining, and therefore being able to compress it to move it to the reaction site might be valuable to you. Also, I believe that just refining it in position and then trying to move it to the reaction site could also be just bulkier than compressed. The ultimate of a miner class fantasy would be the ability to mine and support. Otherwise, why did I have to train a new miner at all? Actually, going back to that, prior to all of these changes, there was, like, the guys who really got into mining and would brag about it, or at least talk about it, like, fondly on podcasts. They were actually the original multi-boxers, right? Like, before everybody just accepted multi-boxing as the only way to do things, they multi-boxed, you know, an Orca and 8 mining barges or exhumers. And it was the act of trying to keep all of the plates spinning that was the interest. They didn't multi-box in order to brute force it. They multi-boxed it to increase the number of APMs to see how much he can get done with his little fleet at the same time. Well, I mean, I'm sure it went up from 8, but this was like back in the day with like Hulkageddon and stuff. So it was a bit more complicated because you also like had to be ready for all of your ships to get blown up too. Before input broadcasting was banned, there were 100 multi-box skiffs in every HiSec belt. Yes, which is why input broadcasting was banned, because the people who legitimately liked multi-boxing by doing that, you know, the plate spinning like mentality were again outclassed by people that were just doing it via the input broadcasting. I think that is more of a problem with the culture in EVE. Everything is min-maxed. There's always a meta. Well, again, that statement that I gave that earlier is just a general, like, that is a truism in game design that's understood. It's just EVE is a perfect example because it's a sandbox. It very much allows players to optimize the front out of their own game. Rook wall has to be erect to compress, right? I do not believe so. They do not have to have their industry court on to be compressing. I don't know whether or not they can compress in a moon shield or post shield yet. All right. Let's jump back into this. But that was part of the fantasy of the Rourke Wall, being some kind of mothership with a carrier, bringing their ducklings around from system to system. Mother hen. I've said this many, many times. Mining, ice mining, compressing for them, getting them up to speed and training them and grooming them. Mother hen. CCP Rattati admits, too, that CCP understands that fans don't simply want to be relegated to fleet boosting roles, but rather something that can create teamwork and the type of emergent gameplay EVE is famous for. One of the things that's interesting about this is that, like, the way other games have fixed this is by saying that, like, it isn't that players don't want to do boosting roles. It's that boosting roles are boring, right? Like, if I'm a bard in another MMO, often the boosting setup is woven in or made complicated enough that it is enticing. Technically, there's a little bit of that with you can technically do like song twisting, as it were, with boosting in EVE, but it's not rewarding enough, and it's not like there's no specialization, like, as a player. There's no knowledge or mastery that comes with being a support role in EVE, outside of Logi, which logistics is, of course, one of the best roles in the game, because it turns out that a complicated and engaging support role is one of the most, like, engaging in the game. All right. I mean, that being said, this overall point still stands, don't get me wrong. Admittedly, though, the new compression system doesn't seem to be hitting the mark. Good call. And CCP is already looking into this. In response to the devlog, the team laid out a few things that they're already looking at. We should probably open that up just in case. Based on the feedback from players, one constant refrain from players, especially on Reddit, is the idea that the new compression changes add tedium, not necessarily compelling gameplay. And this is what I said too, right? Like, it's work without pay, right? Like, you have to do things, fiddly things, but your reward is technically a loss of resources. That sucks. This is why I think that they actually should make it so that compression, it becomes like purification and ends up increasing the overall minerals that you get out of it if you do it by a small amount, but at least something that makes it feel like there's a reason why you're there and doing this. Before compression was instant, you'd compress and boom, done. Because, okay, here's the thing. The issue should be I compress at a loss, or I don't compress and I get its full value. But that, when combined with the idea that if I compress slowly in space with my big stuff, then I can do it more efficiently. Because it goes back to that, what do you want to be rewarding thing? If the behavior that you want to reward is the mining and compressing on site, then that should be the optimal path. If it's still optimal to just reprocess it in place, I mean, you could argue that, like, well, everything I just said before, where like it's harder to move it once it's compressed, but like outside of moon ore, I still feel like that's a false. You're putting two cost benefit analyses on top of each other, and that's why it doesn't feel rewarding, right? You are going the extra mile to use a rock wall to do it, but it's still a compromise. You're still destroying resources in order to compress it, right? And you know what? I honestly don't think one of the things I keep thinking about this is like, if this changes, if this was the way it always was, how would we feel about it? And I still don't think it would have worked out the way that they wanted it to. I think that this is just not great. Before compression was instant, you'd compress and boom, done. Now compression gameplay is so complex, especially as it stands on Singularity in the current form. It adds tedium in the form of repetitive clinking and constant management versus being able to simply compress and move on to the next task. This is actually an interesting statement for me because it makes me wonder what exactly they're going to be targeting. Is it the rates and the feeling of value that they feel is the problem? Or is it the need to drag it, which they even admit was a compromise, right? Like, and are they, which is right? Is it true that like, if you just made it so it wasn't tedious and it just pulled from your orbit, if it pulled from the correct bay and put into the correct bay such that it was just something that cycled in the background when, as you needed it to, would the rest of the things about it still be a problem? Yes or no? I mean, ultimately, we may not ever know, but it'll be interesting to see how CCP thinks about that problem. Imperium News, an EVE Online player-run news site helmed by the Imperium, hence its name, broke it down in a video. We're not going to watch the whole video because that's just Inception at that point. Even if the numbers themselves don't exactly check out, and as somebody who's not so great at maths, as Shank will attest, I can only take this with a grain of salt, that a ton of time for something that should be fun. Right. So again, this goes back to not how it behaves mechanically in the universe, but how it feels to the person. Do these changes make it better or worse for bots? Ironically, it makes it better for bots because it is a repetitive, tedious task that nobody wants to do that just checks in on whether or not you're there every couple of minutes in order to like make sure the ore gets refilled. So technically, this is a giant like honeypot for bots. You are almost, it almost seems set up to make you want to bot this process, right? I mean, if you think about it, maybe that's the argument we should make. CCP, do you want Rockwall bots? Because this is how you get Rockwall bots. Compression was intended to be the most interesting add-ons additions. I love that. Oh shit. This is the thing that everybody was supposed to like. Oh God. It definitely wasn't meant to be an oppressive thing. Again, how it feels. I think the balance here is that we're trying to strike at a time when it was, at the time was that it was hard to. We didn't have the tech we needed. Yes. So hold on. Yes, you're right. You didn't have the tech that you needed, which caused a problem, which made it more tedious than you were supposed to. This is why I want to make sure that you get the right idea, because it's not just the fact that it was awkward, right? It's the fact that you promised people that this was going to make things, if not fix everything, at least better. And so having the most interesting add-on provide a overall net more difficult, more painful, and more importantly, unrewarding play style. Like, okay, if I'm hauling, there's kind of a baked in value to that we understand, right? It's here, I need it here. I'm willing to pay a certain amount for that to happen. Compression destroys some of the value, and therefore it is really difficult to then allocate. It is not impossible. Technically speaking, you could just write it into the books, and like correctly minded groups could adapt and still budget a reward for the person who's willing to do that. But it's not ingrained and it's not obvious. It looks like all of this work is destroying value, not creating it. And that's why it feels unrewarding, not just because it's fiddly. So that added the UX issues like dragging it into the ammo. It felt interesting at the time. This is actually such a classic, dev or specifically game dev problem, right? Because like the first time you do things, first couple of times you do something, it's like, oh, this is kind of cool. Yeah. Well, what happens when it's, the 30th time or the 300th time? And they built this paradigm around it. But I think that there were just issues that we ran into that we hadn't foreseen, like people docking in rogue walls and dragging into them. That was an issue that we discovered on Singularity that you couldn't drag into the hold. Either we missed it during testing or we assumed it would work, but that was an oversight. The timing of compression was meant to simply be a counterweight to going back to the station and dumping it there. Well, you missed it by a few minutes. So you're gauging it as logistically sound to jump home, or do I stay here and compress? That's the kind of choice that makes sense. And then you factor your compression ratio into the compression to my compression ratio. Do some math in your head, and if you're savvy, you're doing it better than other people. So now you have a competitive advantage, right? By giving this complex issue, different people will solve it different ways, and that the correct solution will give you a competitive advantage. Sure. You're better at running the system. It was never meant to be oppressive. Yeah, but what is the better way to run the system? What does it actually look like versus the thing that people would naturally want to do? Right? That's the real question. It was never meant to be oppressive. Well, you could do it the easy way, or you could do it the hard way, which now feels like the correct way. How is that not supposed to feel oppressive? That is almost the definition of oppressive. I actually, Joe Hill, I unironically still love the idea of putting all of this into the survey side of things as opposed to the compression waste side of things. All right. We're not going to do this. Okay, here we go. So with compression, we're definitely hearing all of that stuff, and we're pulling it back to improve it. Like, no question about it. We're not going to go with this unchanged. We did it, Reddit. No. So this is something that I've been musing about, and this is something I was going to say. If this sentence wasn't in here, this is something I've been meaning to say a lot. Haven't gotten around to it yet, so I'll just say it here now. What? No, that's not a triple negative. We are not going to go with this unchanged. In other words, they will either not do it at all or at least change it first. They're saying it's not a triple. Is that a comma? No, that's a period. These are two sentences. So, no question about it. And then we're not going to. What are you not going to do? You're go through with this unchanged. But that's not the same as saying we're going to change it before going through with it. And it's not the same thing as saying we're not going to do this. So I think that this is the correct statement to make. Ever seen gold mining? I live in Oregon. I've lived in Oregon most of my life. Have I ever seen gold mining? I'm just going to move on. Yes, that's where... Why do you think I've been saying... Never mind. Another mechanic that is seen as a point of contention from the update is the new mining waste mechanic. the new mining waste mechanic, especially for mining corporations that are looking at how this would affect new players looking to get into the profession. The idea of waste from mining, especially when we're talking about getting it out of the age of scarcity, specifically didn't sit well with some. And others were concerned about what new players who hadn't trained yet their higher quality mining modules would be ostracized for creating more waste than yield. The team heard this too, and Rattati admits that the team may have just missed their negative impact that this might have on a new player. Again, I think the solution is really simple. Just make it so that the frigates don't generate waste, or not nearly as much waste. That strip miners are what causes the waste. That makes sense. Strip mining is more wasteful than mining lasers. How is that a hard thing to get across? Oregon is California with low rent for now. We really wanted players to be able to progress with this and also diverge in specialization. So the point with waste was to be able to sacrifice a yield but spend the asteroid. But it's not there isn't really specialization. What's interesting is like the old crystals did provide specialization. If you had the correct skills, the T2 module, and the correct crystal all together, you got better yield. But this encourages you to just have faction shit. In fact, it doesn't benefit you to specialize at all. There's no specialization. It's just get good, scrub, right? So you could theoretically tinker with it, do it slower and raise the yield in the sail way. That same, I'm assuming. Maybe one guy in the Klondike with a pickaxe, and he's like, "Oh, I have a vein," and then the excavator can just eat mountains of ore quickly. This is a surveying issue. The guy who says, "Oh, I found a vein," finding the vein is the important, exciting piece here. Not that the excavator goes through an entire mountain. That's the high waste. The little guy with the mining pick should not have any waste. Like, you just explained my point. All right, whatever. If you do that because you just sift through it and you get thrown out with the trash, that's kind of that's kind of the fantasy that we wanted to do. Yeah, great. You just didn't. And so everyone could find their niche and go deep into that specialization. Again, what is the depth? But it is true. It literally defines by there's three different tiers. There's Tech 1, which is also shared by mining drones and excavators. Tech 2 and Faction. That's it. And the best one is Faction. Again, that's not specialization, that's upgrading. This patch is not a shit show. It's not out yet. So far, we've already gotten compression dealt with. So let's keep going. Let's keep going. Let's have faith. But it is true. Waste being perceived this way, even if someone has the kind of waste, even if everyone has the same kind of waste in the beginning, so all new players are the same. So if you're recruiting as a corporation, you forgive them for wasting because everyone is wasting at the new player. This is something that CCP is like universally failed to identify in a lot of cases in this way, which is that like, that isn't how players are going to look at it. They're not going to look at it like, oh, well, everybody starts at this much and you make it better. No, the standard is the best you can get. And everything worse than that is a compromise, right? Like that's the thing. That needs to, and I'm not saying that that's bad, but that needs to be the way that needs to be what you're thinking about when you're putting it in mind. You're not going to get people. This isn't like an anchoring bias where like a new bro sees how much they make and they're like, okay, this is it. No, this is a competitive game. It's going to be cooperative. This is the exact reason why the rope wall is a problem in the first place, right? It's not that the mining barges don't mine very much. It's that the rope wall makes it so that okay amount of mining is considered to be negligible because it's not a rope wall. It's why level 4 missions are like some people think aren't worth it because Titan ratting exists. Like people don't think, oh, well, Titan ratting is the extreme thing. No, they think that mission running is the shit version. All right. So if you're recruiting a corporation, you forgive them for wasting. Yes. And that would actually be, this is actually true, because this means that new bro organizations that focus on new bros will also be willing to forgive their mistakes or their new broness. And while that might be execution issues when it comes to like combat fleets, in mining it might be their waste. But the fact that they're not mining very much, I think, is enough. Like people want more throughput. They don't want to not be as much of a shitbird to the people around them. Train this up so you can stop being a blue falcon. All right. It's kind of like, okay, we get them up to speed and start training. There's also a negative aspect of this that I think that we missed. It's just like, it sucks to be a new player and 100% waste. They're like, is this my fault? What am I doing wrong? They're not even aware of it. People have to explain to them why they're being excluded. Should I be doing something else? I think it's absolutely relevant feedback. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the choice becomes a better choice whether to waste or not to waste. Sorry. I think that system won over player centricity, and we're happy to rework it into a different schematic. Reverse it in a way that new players don't see it, and the choice becomes a better choice whether to waste or to not waste. So it sounds like we're 2 for 2 here. Sounds to me like not only are both of these changes not only going to be looked at, but looks like they're both getting pretty fundamental changes. The compression thing they might only be looking at it from a technical point of view, but it looks like here they really do get the fact that the waste mechanic is not only not working, but is possibly completely bass-ackwards. Which, you know, I'm happy for them to say such a thing. At the end of the day, the devblog was, according to CCP, one part of the journey where the team is like, yes, the part of the journey that they set up for 6 months and then several days hyped it up as being the thing to be excited about. You did this to yourself. Where the team is laying out their plans and the idea as one step of the overall direction. But after 2 years, multiple conflicts, whether they be NPC driven or player driven ones, and scarcity that has been felt across EVE's thousands of systems, especially players who aren't part of the large nullsec alliances and can't fall back on the alliance coffers and stockpiles, the idea of moving into an age of prosperity was most welcome indeed. Yes, which is why this needed to be like the symbol of what that meant. The medicine could have come later. Anyway, history with the player base and the dev team too plays a role, as many of the fans have felt burned by what they perceive to be failed promises, and therefore aren't necessarily in the most forgiving mood when it comes to issues arising. I'll happily admit the package isn't explained well enough. It's more like, call it a code diff. This is what it is. This is what it is now, without the purpose or the intent, CCP Rattati said. And I think that we could have done much better with the purpose of these changes, what the purpose of these changes were, and how it all fit together, and what the ideas here were. So some of this was like badly explained, or it lacked a compelling story. I think when the frame isn't painted clearly, players don't know where to put their mind on this feedback. The last question asked by the other guy has been echoed throughout the discourse. Oh, sorry. I think, oh no, that was the other guy who said that. Man, this other guy says like the smartest stuff out of this whole thing, I think. Whether a Reddit or the forums or even my Twitter DMs, the idea of what the end goal, the long-term vision of EVE is something that has come up a lot in the scarcity era. And it's something that CCP themselves will need to do a better job of laying out to players in the future. I fully admit, too, having the ability to speak to the developers on a pretty regular basis in my job, even I was a little naive in the thinking that the end of scarcity meant a return to the status quo in the before times. Okay. At this point, I'm going to just point out that when the alpha program was being announced by CCP, and they had interest in, you know, making sure that this was communicated clearly to the developers, or sorry, to the player base, it was important to CCP Siegel that a member from the community was able to go up and ask and challenge and talk about it with her. And I was put forward to do so and did that interview. And it was really, I think it went really well. And I believe helped, at least some. So I have actually, full disclosure, I've now emailed the support team and said, hey, if you all want to talk to me, I would love to talk to CCP Rattati about all this. So who knows? We'll see. Hopefully that means that we'll be able to sit down with him and challenge some of the stuff and talk about it and see what comes out of that. I think that would be a very valuable conversation. I don't believe I've ever actually sat down and spoke with CCP Rattati before. So, see, I actually kind of like the skill UI in a backwards kind of way. So either way, simply because I like what the skill UI, I like this, what the skill changes allow us to do, not necessarily the UI itself. I should be clear. I think when the frame isn't printed, we already went there. While the protests themselves caught the attention of CCP Games over the weekend, the feedback is what's winning the day. See? The protest catches their attention. The feedback is what wins the day. Though some of it had been downright harsh and at times crossing the line, CCP Rattati admits that the feedback feels harsher than it has ever been. However, the team is, and this is actually a point that has been driven out to me before too, especially when I was talking about the protests. It's like, yes, this is like every other protest, but have you ever seen one of these every other protests be at this scale? And to that, the answer is no. No, I haven't. Since that original one, obviously. However, the team is all about getting as much feedback as possible because at the end of the day, the constructive feedback helps to make EVE into what everyone's goal at CCP lasts forever. I see no reason to be ashamed at this. This is all part of the process. When talking about this negative feedback being received since Friday, the only thing I regret in all of this is the hostility. I feel like the toxicity in the feedback is very harsh. If I hadn't been doing this for many years, I'd probably be at home right now. But you need a thick skin to wake up to, resign because you're ruining everything messaging. So again, going back to that previous meme, I also want a meme of the exact same thing with the gallows and it being CCP Fozzie saying, first time, to CCP Rattati. But you need a thick skin. Yeah, okay. Like everything has become yelled louder, become more toxic on the forums, and this whole sentiment feels like it's going into this direction. Then it just becomes impossible to interact. This is what I'm always concerned about. I started on day one to kind of chime in and have a conversation. This is actually a very hallucinating statement here. Then the day after, like everything I've said has been taken out of context, and I'm like, okay, this isn't cool. I'm going to try again. And I go in and try to have a normal conversation. And at the end of it, I'm like, okay, I don't think I'm making any progress at all. Dude, I know them feels. That's how this works. That's how all of this works. Again, like the public can frame or reframe or consider your words however the fuck they want, man. It's a mess. And I'm not excusing what he did say, but like just that story of his journey, I can definitely see like, no, I'm going to prove a point. Oh, well, that didn't work. I'm going to try to be really nice about it. Oh, well, that didn't work. I'm going to go home now. Like, in addition to that, the problem is that I'm sure, like, since he came out the gate swinging, even when he tried to return and be nice about it, everybody brings in his first responses into the context. Ugh. Again, my lament here is broken down communication leads to mistakes. That's all. So the tone of the conversation could have been better, and I'm happy to work on that with everyone. But we're all here in EVE Online, and that's what we're called into question, our integrity, and that's why we're doing this. It's all about EVE Online forever. It's always been. But I will say, okay, there's been a temperature running high in the community, but there's also been a lot of great discussions. That's also true. And there's also been a lot of people that enjoy it. There are people that say, you're on the right path. This isn't doom and gloom at all. And I'm not trying to downplay the protests or whatever. full on freedom of speech and everyone is allowed to say their opinions. But there are a lot of people that are also happy with these changes. And there are a lot that can be used and that will continue to be built upon. Yeah, and that's a really fair sentiment. Like, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of about these changes that people do like. And there's a lot about this proposal, because let's call it what it is, right? These aren't changes anymore. They've all been taken back, more or less. So now they're just proposals. Oh, I actually led up to something earlier, and then I forgot to actually follow up with it. The thing that this reminds me of is the jump mechanic changes, right? And this is what I was going to call them out of. It's like, if you guys can bring back the jump change or the jump portal animation, or the jumping animation, you can pull that feature back and work on it for another year before reintroducing it in a way that is satisfactory, then you have no excuse to release the rogue wall compression, or the compression changes the way they are. That was actually the argument I was going to make, but thankfully it doesn't look like I need to make it anymore. But yeah, I invoke the jump changes because that was an excellent example of them proposing something. The player base went, not good enough. And they're like, okay, never mind. And then they came back a year later and went, is this good enough? And we were like, yep, that's great. And they're like, cool. And now it's in the game. So if this becomes that, then great. Aren't they all proposals as long as they're on Sissy? Yes. But what I'm saying is that I'm playing language game right now specifically to point out that these are no longer changes that are happening. This is no longer probably what's going to happen. This is now things that were proposed and now will not happen. Does that make sense? Because we know for a fact that these changes are not going to happen now. So these are now just a proposal, a former proposal. So from that proposal, things can be learned from. That's all I'm saying. Now, obviously, a lot of work probably went into this proposal, including the development efforts that actually go into execution of this proposal. But the point is that if they're not going to release it as is, then we can really talk about what the real the next iteration would be, if that makes sense. Where were the protests when they killed off ratting? Moving on. Well, that's my point. Like, a lot of these changes did involve little protests, but they were never, I mean, like, it was always seemed like an entitled, petulant, child. Arguably could potentially be, but there's enough sound arguments behind the protest. The protest alone didn't make the changes. The good feedback alone didn't make the changes. Both together probably is what got us to this point, right? The sound reasoning let CCP concede that they might be wrong, knowing that they probably were, at least in something, because it was always meant to be like, early, open to change. And the protest shows them how much energy is behind those level-headed proposals. The next iteration will be 4 times more roids and 400% waste. Yes. Obviously, the only problem here was the magnitude, right? At the end of the day, it feels like a fundamental inability to completely manage expectations, my own included. As a software developer, that is your second main priority. Your first main priority is writing good code. Your second main priority is managing expectations. And has left Eve feeling like the community and the dev team are particularly perched on the edge of a knife. Whilst the protests themselves had died down since reaching record numbers of people in G 4.4 over the weekend, the discourse had not, and likely won't for some time to come. One thing's for certain, though, CCP determined to leave the scarcity end behind for good, whatever this ends up looking like in the aftermath. All right. Well, I think that's good. I think that's fine. He definitely gives a lot of defenses, a lot of reasoning. And I think that it's really important to see that they are both not going forward with the compression changes as is and not going forward with the waste mechanics as is. Why did I have to read this in MMORPG? Why is this not on the launcher? Why is this not an immediate dev blog? Why is this not louder? Like that specific. Why is this? This is a large article, right? I skimmed through this, and the first time I skimmed through it, I didn't get both of those points. It really feels like this is not the lead to bury, guys. The pitchforks and mobs are screaming. You might want to yell, calm down, we're not going to do it anymore, as loud as you fucking can. Anywho. We'll see. Preaching to the choir. I'm preaching to anybody who'll listen. Not enough space for Plex and pack ads. Come on, man. Give it a rest. All right. Let's see. The feedback says here that they pulled up here. Not to mention that the looks of things, people who mine with the lower tier mining lasers will have a negative impact on the yield of everybody else. It's definitely not massively increased the amount of toxicity in the game. That's a good, yeah. Being able to blame other people for your problems is not a great way to build a friendship machine. That's a good point. That's a solid point. All right. I'm going to be right back, go to the bathroom, all that such, and then we will jump into the economic reports.